Hey, welcome to Weekly Marx. It's the 15th of December. Time flies and you're having fun. I did make a comment last time about Trotsky sectarian differences, and there are multiple sub-parties, and here is a map of the Fourth International, putative Fourth International, with all of the different Trotskyist sub-parties. Not my particular cup of tea, but an interesting argument and one that has been considered. I included an article on from 2016 accusing Jeremy Corbyn of being not necessarily being a Trotskyist necessarily, but um, Deputy Party Leader Tom Watson, he's no longer Deputy Party Leader, accused Trotsky entryists are twisting arms of young labor members to back Jeremy Corbyn. And, entryism just means that, people are going to, join conventional parties in order to engage the the state. That it's important to be members, to have to be part of elections, et cetera. So there are militant tendencies within the context of Trotskyism, some of which are built around a variety of militant initiatives, and we could say that there's a fair number and they're a wide range. The other element that I want to talk about today, and it's not really about this specifically, but it's one in which I do have a position. The word stochastic terrorism. It is a way of talking about random violence, random acts of violence, but um, violence, once it's executed, is not random. It has intention. It may be arbitrary, but it's not random. The idea of talking about randomness is a problem. And more specifically, um, the use of mass communications to stir up random lone wolves to carry out violent or terrorist acts that are statistically predictable but individually unpredictable. This is kind of the problem of what we'll talk about today, to think that things are more chaotic than they are. And of course, plausible deniability for those creating media messaging. And all of this is a media effects argument. It has to do with accountability, certainly. The appearance of randomness is what terrorism is about. That's, so stochastic, making it stochastic doesn't make it any more precise, but in fact, increases the randomness, the impression that you just can't do anything about it. And so it is, in effect, no different than any of the larger media effects argument for example, television or media violence, that to claim that violent cartoon programs make children more violent. It may be that it can do that, certainly, but whether it does in a more direct kind of causal way is problematic when you start talking about it, because you're asking the question of whether there is some sort of your children are having psychotic breaks or whatever. It just gets too stupid. Similarly, for adults, in the case of the CEO killer, this is a similar argument. It's not terribly, people who begin to have their psychotic break, I think you can begin to sort of map that. That doesn't mean that every person who has one is going to be violent or is violent or is ever violent. See, that it's a problematic argument. It leads to some pernicious sort of outcomes, and you sort of want to think about that. That, for example, if you wear a bulletproof vest but you don't carry a firearm, you can still be liable for something. And this is, that there are that people have been prosecuted for, or at least a sort of subcategory of prosecution, that you may not have anything, a lethal weapon, but the wearing of a bullet-resistant vest is supposedly a, provocation of some kind. So you want to get into, the precision or imprecision of those kinds of things. So that's kind of where we're leading with today. And it's not so much about violence, but it is about chaos. Not the villainous group of Get Smart, but um, chaos as in chaos theory. And what does it have to do with Marx? It's actually a key element in the longer discussion about the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. A couple of days ago, Michael Roberts, we've talked about before, put up another of his little blog posts, which was circulated by Brave New Europe. And I'll just read his component of it and then sort of skip through what he is referring to, which is a work by his friend, and I think a really an important person to talk about a certain variety of, the kind of heterodox critique, and that is, the idea that there's a productionist argument, and then there are circulatory or circuit-driven or distribution, Department 1 versus Department 2 arguments, which is why we're looking at Volume 2. I assume that this coming week that Higginbottom will do his Lecture 10, and then we'll be able to sort of conclude that and then get onto Capital Volume 3 at some moment, which is what this sort of involves. The law of the tendential fall of the average rate of profit, the LTRPF, lies at the very heart of Marxian economics. It's essential to explain all aspects of the capitalist economy, from economic crises to imperialism and the theft of international value inherent in imperialism. In short, it is essential for labor's indictment of and struggle against capitalism. One such critique that has gained some traction in Marxist circles is that by Marxists Emmanuel Farhon and Moshe Machover in their book written in 1983 and republished by Verso in 2020 called Laws of Chaos. Interesting that it does get republished in the sense that, we sort of need to talk about this stuff because it is still about a key topic, one with much ink has been spilled. Let's see, Farhon is at, let's see, Machover is at London, University of London, the philosopher, and Farhon is at, I think, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, I think, and is a mathematician. And they're just an interesting combination, and they're both Marxists, and clearly engaged with Palestinian elements, both of them. So, or I think it's Machover is a communist, and Farhon engages Palestinian matters. So these are people who are still, engaged, even though they're interested in such highfalutin areas. They argue that Marx's transformation of the values of commodities by the equalization of individual rates of surplus value, profit, that is, into prices of production based on an average rate of profit for all capitals is indeterminate. Now, let me just stop there and say that indeterminacy, is not a absolute category. It is, it seems that way, but it is a way in which we can characterize a variety of things, and it has a variety of meanings, both on it with the simple dichotomy of social science or science versus humanities. So, there's a whole literature, and we can talk about that till cows come home. But the point is, it is about the equalization of individual rates of surplus value into prices of production based on an average rate of profit for all capitals. So this is a totalizing argument at one level. At another level, more difficult. And Carcetti resists this because for a variety of reasons, and we'll get to that. this is the summary that Roberts gives, which is a good summary. Supposedly, in Marx's Capital, Volume 1, the price of a commodity is determined by the value contained in it, that is, at the level of individual value. While in Capital 3, it is determined by its social value, the value it has after individual profit rates are modified by their equalization into an average. Thus, values are converted into prices of production. Now, this relation between Capital 1, Volume 1, and Volume 3, as we've tried to note with Higginbottom's presentation, is to note that, they're all kind of connected. And, saying one thing, it's one thing in Volume 3 and one thing in Volume 1 doesn't really quite cut it. But that's kind of where we're headed. Like many other critics, Farhoon and Machover reckon that this conversion is inconsistent because prices of production would then not be uniquely determined by a quantity of value in labor time. Farhoon and Machover argue that Marx was wrong, and Marxists must recognize that there is no rigid relation between labor content and price. The ratio between price and labor content is a random variable which can assume for a given individual transaction any positive numerical value whatsoever. What Marx and the rest of us apparently need to recognize is that individual profit rates are not determined by any definite amount of value measured in labor time, but are chaotic. That is, ruled by the laws of probability. So there is no average rate of profit, but only a scatter of profit rates. Let me stop there and say laws of probability. This is the problem that is being critiqued by Carcetti, is that there's kind of a probability assumption that, claims that because it's probabilistic that there can be no average computed. Well, no, that's not quite true. I mean, at certain levels, you can characterize certain things as chaotic, as probabilistic. But ultimately, when you get back to reality, there is a set of expectations that is built into this. This is kind of the whole key to the rational expectations argument that is problematic in and of itself. In the paper attached, that's Carcetti's paper. The link is there, and which is printed below. Determination and probability in Marx's transformation problem. My colleague, Guillermo Carcetti, refutes this chaotic theory of the relation between the value of commodities and the prices of production. A scatter as a whole always has an average. It is an essential feature of any group of numbers. It arises necessarily from it and together with it. It follows that the average does not pre-exist the scatter. Each time a scatter arises or changes, the average rises or changes too. And a decreasing sequence of averages measures a decreasing average quantity of surplus value generated relative to the capital invested within a given time frame. That is an average rate of profit, perfectly determinable and not chaotic. You could argue, in fact, that all the ink that got spilled was problematic only because there wasn't enough empirical work, and that, hence I was raising that question with the supercomputers again. Not that I have faith in supercomputers. It's just that, computationally, you can sort of get to, I think, some reasonable indices. Now, why does any of this matter? Well, if an average rate of profit on capital invested cannot be determined, and instead it is either non-existent or merely random, as opposed to arbitrary, then this drives a hole through Marx's law, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And in turn, any compelling explanation of crises in capitalist production. And note that crisis, whether you're looking at Naomi Klein or, a bunch of other folks, crisis is still important in considering where the problems are. And, without backing up into a lot of theory, but, monopoly positions, monopoly capitalism can and does create crises. I think empirically you can show this without a lot of trouble. So back to the Roberts. However, in the attached paper, Carcetti shows that the probabilistic approach is wrong and indeed a step backwards in Marxist theory. So that's pretty definitive. Note that the original work by Farhoun and Markover is done in 1983. It's a 1983 text. It does a lot of sort of dynamic analysis and shows from a mathematical point of view that you can argue for the relative randomness at very large numbers and make some comments on sort of dynamic things. Then they resemble, with all due respect, resemble some things that Sheikh is looking at, but this is Sheikh is actually trying to locate this within more credible, global numbers, international numbers from, IMF, World Bank, blah, 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 UN. So, and they aren't random. So that I would assert to you that, the argument is much more complicated and has more precision even in a macro sense. So here's Carcetti's paper, Determination and Probability in Marx's Transformation Problem, introducing the probabilistic critique. The law of the tendential fall of the average rate of profit, for short, the law, lies at the very heart of Marxian economics and is essential to explain all aspects of the capitalist economy, from economic crises to imperialism and the theft of international value inherent in imperialism. In short, it is essential for labor's indictment of and struggle against capitalism. It is thus not by chance that it's been the object of sustained attack since the publication of the third volume of Capital. The law, that is, the law of the tendency of profit to fall, has been the target of two basic strands of criticism. The first argues that the average rate of profit does not move downwards. It can move upwards or be directionless. This has been the traditional battleground on which innumerable battles have been fought. Here it can be only mentioned that the critique is ignorant of Marx's distinction between tendency and counter tendencies, which, this is a sublated element. It's part of the dynamics of it that you should not sort of exclude. The second critique is to get the issue out of the way. This is post Steedman, et cetera, and deny that the individual profit rates converge toward an average. Rather, their movement is supposed to be chaotic, and thus ruled not by determination as in Marx, but by the laws of probability. And let me stop here and say, this is one of the bigger issues, is that you have to begin to say, well, is it fully probabilistic, or are there determinations? There are determinations. I mean, you can argue the probability stuff, but ultimately you still get back down to some set of, without, getting too far afield, some series of determinations. But that's a dialectic assumption that perhaps, you have to get back into to ask questions at a logical level about what is or isn't the difference of determination in the context of what logic means. It follows that the relation between a certain value and a certain price is severed, and ultimately Marx's law of value is jettisoned. This view is coherently argued in Farhoun and Markover. What follows is not a review of this book. Rather, it focuses only on some of the book's main features in order to evaluate the probabilistic approach to the so-called transformation problem. And number two is here we move to the transformation problem made easy. Now, it's easy because he describes it here, but when you get to the next couple sections, it goes into math, and I will skip that for just so people don't get headaches. The production of commodities requires labor, which is their value. Commodities are sold at money price. What is then the relation between quantities of labor value and quantities of money? The transformation of commodities values, that is, their labor contained, into their money prices is the essence of Marx's price theory. Note, of course, that this question of labor contained gets deflected into, sort of the idea of an abstraction called labor power, which is not necessarily the same thing as labor itself. Its core is the redistribution of surplus value, because that's kind of where we're trying to head to at one level of abstraction, which in turn presupposes the formation of an average rate of profit, ARP. Let us briefly sketch Marx's approach. Capitals, that is plural capitals, which percentage-wise invest less in labor power and more in more efficient means of production, technology, produce less surplus value, but increase their productivity. That is the output per unit of capital invested. They therefore produce less value, which is contained in a greater output. So there's some gain is occurring. Capitals which have been left behind in the competitive struggle, for example, those which percentage-wise have invested less in means of production like tech than in labor power, produce more value, which is contained in a smaller output. So the total output level is lower in that particular context. And with all due respect, that's the kind of Marx's story, right? And he's talking about, textile mills and what Engels is talking about in the working class, et cetera. That's all kind of there. And generally we actually sort of accept that, because if you don't accept it, then your arguments about the 300-mile limit around Dover and the Industrial Revolution kind of get weakened. So the high productivity capitals, the ones with technological substitution, are rewarded through the appropriation of surplus value from the low productivity capitals. You see some shifting in this larger abstraction from low productivity to high productivity. This is looking at a large aggregation. In fact, price competition ensures a tendential convergence for the same unit price for the same product. The high productivity producers produce a greater output than that of the low productivity competitors because they made these technical substitutions. If both outputs are sold at the same price, the former realize a greater quantity of surplus value per unit of capital invested, and thus realize a higher rate of profit. There's greater profit extracted because you made this technical substitution. The low productivity and the high productivity capitals do not sell to each other. Now they can, but in this, just for the sake of this argument, that is because they're producing the same commodity, that is the same object. How many people does it take to make a Hello Kitty doll? And you suddenly begin to bring in a robot or something, whatever. But sell to capitals from other sectors. So the low productivity capitals lose surplus value to capitals in the other sectors, which is gained by the high productivity capitals. This is how the ARP within sectors comes into being, because there's a difference between the two, and then you get an average. Not necessarily a median, right? At the same time, the technologically backward capitals, instead of competing within their sectors, can move to other sectors where they can reap a higher profitability. Now, note that this resembles the Ricardian rent argument, right? That you kind of, here's a crappy piece of land as opposed to a land where you get a tractor, whatever. You can see how this kind of argument can go. The final outcome is a tendency towards a general average rate of profit for the whole economy. Note that this is an aggregate number, and it is a number, and it is from an aggregate. So, it is not probabilistic in that context. Two critiques of Marx's transformation. Given the centrality of Marx's transformation method and of the role of ARP within it, it is not surprising that this method has been the object of sustained criticism. Now, before turning to the probabilistic alternative, see section 6 below. Between sectors, two major strands of criticism will be briefly mentioned. The first is, in the words of the authors of the Laws of Chaos, whether the value of a commodity should be determined by the amount of labor actually spent on it, or by the amount of labor socially necessary to produce it, right? Remember, this is a fundamental argument within, Marx's model, productive model. As is well known, Marx opts for the latter definition, that is socially necessary labor, labor power, etc. 4, if value were to be determined by the actual amount of labor time spent in producing the given individual commodity, then two identical commodities could have different values simply because one of them was produced by particularly slow workers or an antiquated technique. But if ideal price is determined by value, then identical commodities could have different ideal prices, which negates the very essence of the concept of an ideal price. I know that sounds like gibberish, but sort of logically consistent. This is one of the many variations on the basic theme. The supposed contradiction between volume one and volume three. Remember that, as I mentioned at the front end, that Higginbottom says, well, volume one and volume three, you sort of need to keep them in hand at the same time. You don't say, well, you have the argument in volume one is superseded by volume three. No, that's just not the case. Remember the path of the writing, volume one is sort of front loaded with portions from two and three because Marx didn't want to kill everyone with the math, and for a variety of other reasons, of course. But that's kind of the issue, is that you get a simplified version in volume one in order to make it intelligible. But the reality is that you need to sort of look at the details eventually. And this is part of the looking at, sort of the eventual questions in two and three. Supposedly in Capital One, the price of a commodity is determined by the value contained in it, that is, individual value, while in Capital Three, it's determined by its social value. Well, the value it has after its profit rates are modified by their equalization and an average. This is problematic only because the conclusion about social value is still, embodied in the front end in Capital One. For the critics, this is inconsistent because to a certain price, there would correspond different quantities of labor, both the individual and the social value, i.e. prices would not be uniquely determined by a quantity of value. This is radically wrong. And this is the point. A commodity acquires its individual value in the process of production. That is when you're making the damn thing. This is transformed into its social value in a different process distribution. This is the whole argument about exchange, that a system of exchange implies the social value, and it's mentioned in volume one, and this whole stupid argument. These are two different temporal processes taking place at different times, a hardly challengeable fact. Yet the critique rests on an implicit assumption that production and distribution take place contemporaneously, i.e. that time does not exist. So note that by the time you get to volume three, time does exist. And it is on this absurdity that innumerable proofs of Marx's so-called theoretical inconsistency have been written. There's a lot of those. Sophisticated mathematical and statistical methods cannot correct this original sin. The second critique, has been called the infinite regression critique. It focuses on the alleged impossibility to compute the value of the means of production. So you're using oranges to prove apples or whatever. More precisely, while it is possible to compute the new labor that has been necessary to produce the wage and luxury goods in this cycle, Department 2, it is impossible to compute the labor that has gone into the production of their means of production because they've been produced in the previous cycle. One would have to go back 1 year and measure the labor that has gone into the production of the means of production in that year, and from there to the previous years. So on in an infinite regression in time. This is Stone Age methodology. This is Carcetti talking. It comes down to the search for the ultimate cause, something that makes impossible any kind of historical inquiry. In other words, moving back in time is not the same as moving forward in time. And that's kind of the presumption when you go, it's the issue for Marx. He's just saying, if we talk in volume one about space and time too much, it gets people confused. And then ultimately this gets solved by the newer accounting elements that we were talking about before, the difference between amortization, depreciation, and all that other stuff. But this aside, to compute the value contained in the means of production used in a certain year, it is sufficient to start counting new labor a year earlier. This move brings past labor to the present and stops infinite regression. The next section details this point. Number 4, section 4, stopping the regression in time. Suppose we want to calculate the value that is abstract labor contained in the means of production. For instance, a machine entering the time 1 to time 3 period at time 2, right? Going back 1 period, a year. The method suggested here is as follows. Don't worry, this is only 1 paragraph, and then I skip the math. We start to count labor 1 period earlier for so many commodities as needed, something straightforward if we dispose of a suitable computerized system of data recording. Thus, to evaluate the value of that machine as an input of T2 to T3, we start our counting at T1 to T2 and count the hours of new labor needed to produce that machine during T1, T2. So it is a kind of counterfactual on the one hand, but this is necessary labor plus surplus labor. So you can make an estimate in that particular sense. You can expect a certain product, a known quantity at T2. Quantity of money paid as wages, W, and profit paid at T2, and corresponds as money manifestation of this quantity of new labor. And then there's lots of math. So I'm going to skip ahead and towards the conclusion. The math sort of works. So the analogy with an ideal gas. Now, the problem, of course, that arises during all that mathematical figuring is, of course, the naturalist or physical or physicist analogies that are problematic. And Farhoon and Markover make the same comment about the analogy to physics. So they say, well, if this works in a gas law in physics, well, then it's going to work in reality. Well, other than people who produce lots of gaslight, it doesn't always necessarily occur. The analogy with an ideal gas is meant to lend scientific credibility to the probabilistic thesis. Actually, the opposite is true. This is Carcetti talking. If the particles of a gas compete for an aliquot that is a equally, distributed or allocated part of energy, a given quantity of heat is differently redistributed. But the quantity of heat does not change. In this sense, this system is in equilibrium. Now, I would assert that it's not a gas law, but it probably resembles more of a law, a chemical law. Let's just put it that way. And one of the reasons why Marx was interested in geology and soil science was exactly to get at these kind of analogous questions. And unfortunately, or whatever, Marx gets to these later on in life, but it is, he still gets there. And you can see where he's pointed. And Bellamy Foster gives us better tools to sort of assess, what are the implications of that for a metabolic analysis. Now, you can critique Bellamy Foster for a bunch of other reasons, but at one level, you can sort of see where this is going. This is back to Carcetti. But in a capitalist economy, technological competition among capitals changes not only the distribution, but also the quantity of value and surplus value produced. In fact, due to technological competition, means of production replaces labor. The surplus value generated per unit of capital invested falls, the average rate of profit falls, and the crisis follows inevitably. The economy neither is nor tends toward equilibrium. This is a very key point. It's because of accepting, or not accepting a kind of equilibrium. And one can argue that this assumption is more static, whatever that means, and less dynamic, whatever that means. Which is one of the reasons why, some people spend a fair amount of time trying to work through the general equilibrium problem. But anyway, back to Carcetti. Rather, it tends toward crises, a fact evident to all except mainstream economists. Contrary to the laws of chaos, the Farhoon and Markover's book, the economy is in constant non-equilibrium, and as we shall see shortly, ruled by deterministic laws. This is the crucial difference. The analogy is misleading. So there's a lot of ink spilled to get us to kind of say, well, the analogy doesn't quite work here, and it has limitations. In Marx, prices emerge at the intersection of two laws of competition. The first law is the law of technological competition. As just seen, it redistributes, but also reduces the total surplus value to be redistributed, that is, the value contained in the commodities. A robot produced Hello Kitty doll is different than a human, produced or manufactured Hello Kitty doll. However, due to price competition, the second law, each capital tends to realize the same quantity of surplus value per unit of capital invested in a given time span. And so ultimately, there is an average price. This is the value tendentially realized or production price. So eventually, after this all is sort of mushing around, we get some sort of average price. This is a tendency. It arises from actual movement. So while you can talk in a probabilistic way, you're not really dealing with sort of path project elements, that there are tendencies, determinations in another kind of sort of idea. So the value actually realized upon the sale of the commodity, entering the market and selling the damn thing is, differentiated, also called market value, is a modification of the production price. So production price is there. There's something other transactional prices, which are not discussed by either Carcetti or McCune and Mackover, but there's a whole literature since the original idea of talking about this that actually becomes fairly important. And yes, there's math for it too, but the institutionalist model, or the new institutionalist model, does feature the issue that is probably the most important for financialization, and that is transaction costs. The most obvious modifying factor is demand. It's true. It is a demand issue, but it's also a supply issue relative to, as I said, transaction costs. It varies differently for each commodity and at different times. And it's clearly a different times thing, because if you look at supply chain analysis and a variety of other things, there are transaction costs. The production price, i.e. the value tendentially realized, is causally determined because given the value of the inputs and the rate of exploitation, the value of the output follows upon the equalization of surplus value. Not the same as the price, right? But the factors modifying the production price, i.e. changes in demand, are also causally determined, as shown by a vast field of research on demand determination. This is why Mosley asks that question of Heinrich, and Heinrich doesn't have, with all due respect, doesn't have as good an answer as we might expect. They might be difficult to spot and quantify. They might even be practically impossible to account for, but practical impossibility does not mean theoretical impossibility, right? And does not change their deterministic nature. Both the production prices and the factors modifying them are causally determined. So causality is still there. So the profit rates, too, are causally determined. They're not indeterminate. Just because we can't quantify all the factors causing demand changes, it does not mean that we can treat demand and profit rates as if they were random. Contrary to the laws of chaos, neither is the capitalist economy in equilibrium, nor tends toward it, nor are the profit rates chaotic. Yet many Marxist authors agree on the chaotic nature of the profit rates. In this, they fail to see the difference between, and this is the important, this is, the key word, the takeaway, the difference between chaos and disorder. The elements of a system, for example, the profit rates, might seem to move in a disorderly fashion at a certain level of abstraction, i.e. if we focus on a specific section of reality. It's not like you throw your hands up in the air. But at a higher level of abstraction, for example, consideration of a more encompassing section of reality, that is a bigger market, a broader set of institutions, might reveal a higher organizational principle, i.e. a social relation. Transaction costs are social relations. You're just adding more bureaucrats, stevedores, truck drivers, whatever, showing that all those elements seemingly moving chaotically move in the same direction, even if each does it in its own way. Profit rates might appear unplanned and directionless, but this looks chaotic only to the empiricist eye. Only thoughtless commentators, is Carcetti, only thoughtless commentators would question that all capitalists pursue the maximum feasible profit rate. This leaves the space open for corruption, shrinkage, theft, whatever. Then the movement of the profit rates is far from being chaotic. Rather, it's guided by the profitability principle, which is the absolute condition for this capitalist survival and expansion. If considered as aliquot, equal dividing parts of total capital, the profit rates are moved by the same force, the profitability motive, like greed. They seem directionless, while in reality, they all move in the same direction towards the maximum feasible profitability. Note, of course, that in maximum feasible profitability, stuff falls off trucks. Let's put it that way, right? I'm not saying that that's a big, but there are other conditions that are part of this whole process before a consumer gets to object. Then it becomes clear that the contradiction between determination and chaos is only apparent. Each profit rate moves towards the same direction. This determination, even if each in its own uncoordinated, different way. It is this plurality of ways to reach the same goal that is wrongly perceived by the laws of chaos, that is the book of Markover and Farhoon, as a chaotic movement. The common search for the maximum feasible profit is a social relation that connects the profit rates into a single system and guides them. They're not consciously planned by an overarching agency, but for our purposes, this is irrelevant. They are planned, and they're given direction behind their back by the capitalist production relation, even in a conflictual way. You could say that the congestion pricing model has some of these elements to it. Determination is the way the capitalist economy works. Chaos as an organizing principle just does not exist, at least not in economic life. The Laws of Chaos book by Farhoon and Markover simply takes it for granted that chaos exists, but does not explain what chaos is. There are entropy effects that they do kind of talk about, but it doesn't quite get there. What does exist is disordered determination, which in its turn is the concrete mode of manifestation of dialectical determination. And so, number 7, determinism, probabilism, and dialectics in economics, notion of determination discussed above can be called formal or ordered determination because it's based on formal logic. Now, the question is whether formal logic rules or whatever. Formal logic has been useful above to argue that reality, that is the profit rates, is only apparently chaotic, but is actually governed by disordered determination. What is a disordered determination? Well, you could say any Trumpian claim is a disordered determination. It's obvious that he wants something, but he's really quite clueless about how to get there. He assumes that it'll work out, but in many instances it doesn't. But how can chaos and determination coexist? One needs a radical change of paradigm. There is no Trumpist paradigm. Trump simply reacts. This is a Marxist notion of dialectical determination as opposed to formal determination. Given 2 instances, A and B, A is said to determine B if A is one of the both one of the conditions of existence of B, because B already exists as potentiality in A. This kind of Venn diagram stuff, and one of the factors contributing to the realization B. This is a kind of materialist condition, i.e., its emergence from a potential to a realized state. So A is the condition of the potential existence and of the actual realization. So you want to make that difference, and it's one that it's obviously there in volume 1, but not enough emphasis is placed on it, with all due respect, in how people talk about it. Then they talk about it, they do volume 1, blah blah blah, and then it gets realized, and we're going, well, there is a difference there, but they just blow past it, and don't quite give it its place relative to volume 1. So, actual realization of B. In this sense, A determines B. So we could say, and without getting into some craziness, there is a connection. But B, upon its realization, becomes in its turn a determining factor of A, but in a different sense, in the sense that it becomes a factor contributing to the reproduction or supersession of A. This is the sublation moment. This is why things move forward. This is how things get valorized, right? In short, A creates the condition of existence or realization of its own reproduction or supersession. Disordered determination is actually dialectical determination. Now, the point is that you may need dialectical logic or an assumption of dialectical logic, which makes it kind of messy, but you don't have to go to probabilistic arguments to get it there. You can. It's certainly a tool that's worthwhile, but you have to see what the constraints are. At any given moment, A determines more conditions of its own reproduction or supersession, B1, B2, etc., to focus only on the plurality of the Bs, thus disregarding A, leads to the wrong conclusion that the Bs are chaotic and disregards their common determination by A. This is what volume 2 is about. It's the circuit, right? And that these circuits, that consider multiple circuits, are nested, as I've referred to before. Moreover, the B's, besides being causally determined by A, are also tied by dialectical determination to each other. This is a materialist idea here. This strengthens the appearance of their being chaotic. Now, you could say that's ideological, and that's this appearance question is sort of connected to that. Finally, A might be, and usually is, inherently contradictory because it contains its contradictory conditions of reproduction or supersession, that is, the B's. So, in economic reality, dialectical determination not only explains chaos, but it also explains change, the transformation of the realized into the potential, and vice versa, of the determining into the determined, and vice versa. Now, this is beyond the horizon of formal determination, that is, formal logic. In their apparently chaotic search for maximum profitability, capitals create a scatter of profit rates. And they do this because, as I've suggested, there's differential costs. A scatter as a whole always has an average, whether it's visible or computed or not, whether it is the outcome of a real movement or not. Given two or more quantities, the average is a quantity intrinsic to them as a whole. It is an essential feature of any group of numbers. It exists necessarily from it and together with it. It follows that the average does not pre-exist the scatter. We're still dealing with real numbers. Each time a scatter arises or changes, the average arises or changes too. So the question whether the average moves toward or away from scatter is meaningless. It follows that the law, that is the law of chaos, Bachover and Farhun, applies also to an oligopolistic, or even by definition, to a monopolistic economy. So essentially, it is useful, but useful only if you see the contingency. That is, that capitalism tends to, converge or whatever, concentrate to oligopolistic and monopolistic forms. The probabilistic approach, on the contrary, is confined to the absurd assumption of perfect competition. This is Joan Robinson's point. There's no such animal. The average is not simply a statistical figure void of real content. On the contrary, it is a measurement of an ontological quantity, a measure of how much surplus value is generated on average in a given sector or in the economy as a whole relative to the capital invested in a given period of time. The question is not whether or not profit rates move towards the average or vice versa, which is a meaningless question. Rather, the question is, how is it that the averages move through time? A decreasing sequence of averages shows a decreasing average quantity of surplus value generated relative to the capital invested within a given time frame. This is the core of the law. It is as valid nowadays as it was in Marx's time. So in other words, it is a question of assumptions and also a question of determinacy. And this is Carcetti's argument with Farhun and Machover, is that you just can't sort of say, well, it's just all chaotic. Well, it might be stochastic. And once you start getting into, stochastic, then it's less random. It's more arbitrary, perhaps, Some final considerations. The probabilistic approach is fraught with serious implications. The major one is the rejection of any deterministic relation between labor content and price. Instead, the law of chaos, Farhun and Machover, holds that there is no rigid relation between labor content and price. The ratio between price and labor content is a random variable, which we can assume for a given individual transaction, any positive numerical value whatsoever. This cancels the so-called transformation problem, but at the same time disintegrates the law of value. So, in arguing one, it's kind of used as a sort of problematic, false dichotomy or whatever. Disintegrates the labor theory of value. Having rejected what they think is a deterministic notion of value, that is, labor equals price, blah, blah, blah. The authors opt for neo-Ricardianism. See, this is that moment where the literature in the 80s moved towards a certain kind of, much more rigid form that is not problematic if you sort of see it in its place, the sort of post-Straussian analysis of Ricardo's work on commodities. So they're reduced to a kind of single model. But anyway, so they define the rate of profit as the monetary price of physical quantities. QED. But behind this move, there lurks the abyss of incommensurability, a feature that undermines the whole physicalist project and thus the laws of chaos by Barham and Monkover. Very simply, if commodities are considered only as use value, the labor embodied in them is only concrete specific labor. Concrete labors are by definition what makes commodities different, and thus differently from abstract labor, cannot be added, divided, etc. In short, specific labors and thus use values cannot be quantified and thus compared. Any economic theory based only on concrete labors or use values, including the LOC, reveals ignorance of Marxist methodology and is stillborn. The rejection of the law cancels the possibility of explaining crises, imperialism, wars, all the dirt and obscenities that come with capitalism. For the LOC book, the theory, the movement of capital units and profit rates is chaotic, and chaos implies equilibrium because it causes no inherent leakage of heat or value if you accept the gas law. The capitalist economy is denied the possibility of generating its demise from within itself. This is the point that Carcetti is making, is that it's still connected to revolutionary change because of the where crisis occurs. A feature of the dialectic view, labor is deprived of an objective basis for its struggle against capital. The probabilistic approach does not concern itself with all of this, something that questions its relevance for an understanding of capitalism's reality and for labor's fight against capital. The probabilistic approach is not only wrong, this is Carcetti, it is a step backward in Marxist revolutionary theory. So that's the end of the Carcetti thing. I will, I put in a little thing here on dialectic logic. And yes, there is dialectic logic, a logic that comes under the under Soviet thinking. And it is built into a kind of Stalinist position, but, whatever. You could read Ilyenkov. It's there. It can be dealt with. A lot of people just don't use it, and or it cannot be used. But it's people are still looking at it. Formalization of dialectics also attracted scholars by applying formal non-classical logic, such as paraconsistent logic. But that's not the only thing. And Farhoon and Markover, particularly Farhoon, I think, puts a fair bit of time, and I'm probably confusing Farhoon and Markover in my little brain, but actually starts looking at the same things that Badiou looks at, and that's a whole lecture for another time. But I worth considering. I included a video that introduces the 3 volumes of Marx's Capital with Heinrich. I include another video on Heinrich's version of it, which is a lengthy, a little couple of hours of yammering. And then I also included, just simply because you need to, you may need the easy version, an audiobook preview for all 3 volumes, volume 1, volume 2, volume 3, just to refresh in your mind, without necessarily plowing through all 3 volumes, how each volume is designed. And a very easy introduction, 20 minutes or so of Introduction to Capital. A recent one, I think this is from a couple of weeks ago. And then for those who have a Maoist kind of thing, there's a framework for thinking about the tragic historical shortcomings of the Maoist approach. For those who arrived late, there is, as I am not disparaging of Trotskyists, Trotskyites. I just was making a comment about the multiplicity of sectarian subgroups of Trotskyism, and I can show you that even they have a sense of that difference, and so you can see that here. And then for those who arrived late,
And your volume is very low.
Oh, well, I have to yell louder, I guess. So anyway,
That's much better.
I close with a thing on Trotskyism and the critique of Trotskyism in the the UK Labour Party, that from 2016. And my little critique of, or not my little critique, is actually Wikipedia's critique of stochastic terrorism, with which I began this little yammering. So that's my yammering so far. Let's see what the yes, thank you, Kelly. Random acts of violence are no longer random once enacted. That's exactly true. It's an anarchist kind of position. Yes, it's cold as it's damn cold here. Yes, I used Hello Kitty as an example, but that's just what happens. Might surplus value be indeterminate simply because it represents theft? Yes, but theft is only one degree of indeterminacy. It's indeterminate in that sense because stuff falls off trucks at various points in the supply chain. For example, stuff kind of shrinkage occurs all over the damn place. So, and you could argue if you're a capitalist that, well, they're just the workers are just hurting themselves when they steal stuff, but we're not hurting ourselves when we divert stuff because we're still making a profit and even a better one in certain places. I hope that yes, Trotsky is a thing that you want to sort of just get a handle on. It is problematic, and particularly when you have to talk to Trotskyists, they have issues, and then they drag you into an intersectional argument or whatever, and I'm going, okay, that's fine, but it's just one of many determinations, and not that it's indeterminate, but rather there's a multiplicity of determinations which drive our work forward, and you just sort of need to be open to that idea. Um, yes, the scene in Two and a Half Men, that's a good example. That's kind of, yes, that's a bargaining example. It's an information example as well. It shows asymmetric. That's an example of asymmetric information and bargaining, and which is really a key point in game theory. And blah blah blah. Anyway, something for some other time. Thank you very much for all your comments. If there are no interventions, questions, brickbats, I'll stop the. I will stop the live stream and we can get back to swearing at each other. Okay, we're off the live stream.